all the thousands who worked their way in. Okay. And Ron is on his way.
And to add to that, we are Flashpoints, a nationally syndicated show across the country, based out of Berkeley. My name is Miguel Avila Molina. This is Dennis Bernstein. And we were invited here to be part of the Social Justice Week of Activism. And as people come in, we'd like you to sit up front, sit up close, because we'd like to do interactive radio. So you, the audience, are also part of what we're doing. Your reactions, your clapping, your hissing, or your boos, whatever. But that's the kind of radio that myself, Dennis, and the crew live for, is to do live radio. For myself, this is my old stomping grounds. I was here in the early 70s. Don't do the math. But it's good to be back here. Lots of changes on the campus itself. But I'm glad that it's still focused on supporting social activism. And tonight's program, we're going to be focusing on the region, North Bay, and some of the most pressing issues affecting the area and the communities. Later in the program here, myself and Dennis will be giving a presentation at 7 o'clock. Talk a little bit about the work that we do and why we're here. Why we're here for 5 decades after the 60s. If some of you do remember, in the mid-60s, it was a time of revolution, change, and a lot of hope. Back to the land, being connected to the earth, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, things were moving in a good, positive way. And then 3.5 years ago, we lost the country to a, what should I say, a corporate-minded, military engaged government that no longer represents the masses of working and working class poor, and for that matter, communities of color. And that is why we're here, to get focus, to be the alternative to that.
Can I invite, we need each one of you to be about 15 people. So
Close.
if you can come up closer, and in the second half, this is a national broadcast. Second half of the show, we're going to welcome people in the audience who might want to have something to say or add to be a part of the broadcast. And we would love to have you come up a little bit closer and be cozy with us. Come on, guys, you can do it.
We have a word.
What was 40 years ago? Thank you, everybody.
Yes,
Join us up here, Ron.
Professor Ron Lopez in the house.
All right, we've got 2 minutes to air time. If you can hear us back at the station. Falcone, are you on the phone with them? Because I want to open up with Francisco's, the children. He's got it. Mike's got it. Will they hear that here? But when we go live, will they hear? They'll hear the station. So they'll hear Francisco, the musical opening. We'll all hear it? Okay, so you're going to cue me. Okay. 1 minute. Hey, my brother. Join us. Come on. Uh-oh, Romeo and Mom. I'm scared. I'm going to run out of here. Like those earrings.
Hey, thank you. Bring a copy of your book for me? Your new poetry book? Yeah, I'm chair of chapter.
You're gonna cue me, Falcone? I can't see you. Everybody turn off their cell phones, including you, Dennis?
Yeah.
From the campus of Sonoma State University in the heart of farm worker country in the sun-soaked Northern California hills, this is Flashpoints from Sonoma State University. And we're here for the students and the teachers. Well, it's a Peace and Justice Week by the students. It's Activist Week, and we are honored to be here with you all. We've got quite the show for you. First, we're gonna start off with an important memory segment with our good friend here, Ron Lopez. He's the chairman of the Chicano Studies department here at Sonoma State, and we're going to talk about Ruben Salazar. How many here know who Ruben Salazar was? See, this is interesting. We're going to talk about that. We're going to tell you something about how important this journalist was and why he was murdered by sheriff deputies in 1968. It's an extraordinary story. We're also going to be talking about another sheriff's murder here in this county. And we're thinking about Andy Lopez, who was murdered not too long ago in this county by a gun-wielding sheriff who decided that this 12-year-old needed to die. And so he put, shall we say, 7 bullets in 10 seconds? And that was the end of Andy Lopez. We miss him, but we're going to remember him as well. We're going to hear about our legendary Peace and Justice Center here in Sonoma State, and there's a lot more. So thank you all for coming. I don't hear the music, but I hope somebody in Radio Land does. So welcome, Ron Lopez, Professor Lopez. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you, Gavilan, for having me here, for inviting me.
All right, well, set the scene. Ruben Salazar, he was a very significant journalist for many reasons in Southern California. I believe he was the first Chicano Latino columnist for the Los Angeles Times. He did a television show, and he was an extremely powerful spokesperson for the Chicano community. And I believe he sort of set the tone by making the point that here there were so many Chicanos and Latinos dying in the Vietnam War for rights that they didn't have at home.
So Ruben Salazar, I think his most famous single statement or line that he wrote in an editorial in the Los Angeles Times. The editorial was titled, "Who are the Chicanos and what does the Chicano want?" And he said a Chicano, this is the definition he gave, a Chicano is a Mexican American with a non-Anglo image of himself. But he's actually a very complicated, complex, nuanced person. He was born in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. His parents crossed the border and eventually moved to Los Angeles. He was I believe he served briefly in the military, but he became a journalist. His first journalism job was actually here locally at the Press Democrat, where he was a cover reporter and did a lot of reporting without his byline, but we do have a Ruben Salazar collection here with a lot of those articles. He then went on to, I believe it was the El Paso Herald. He served in Vietnam as a reporter for Stars and Stripes. He was also in 1968 in Mexico during the Tlatelolco massacre. He was pulled out of there very quickly, and he returned to Los Angeles, where he went to the Los Angeles Times, and he became quickly involved with the Chicano movement. But he lived in Orange County. He was a Mexican American, and we're talking about the mid to late 60s. He was married to an Anglo-American woman, which wasn't entirely unheard of, but wasn't common at the time and wasn't approved of. And he lived in a white suburb. So he had gone through this period of time where he was a very critical, highly analytical reporter. But as he was working in Los Angeles, he saw that the Mexican-American civil rights struggle, the Chicano movement, was articulating the needs of the community in a way that had not been done. He started reporting on police brutality, and actually the sheriffs and the police visited him and called him to their office and threatened him and said, "You have to stop reporting on this." And his response was, "I'm going to report on the truth, and if you stop brutalizing the community, I will stop, reporting on what you're doing." In 1970, in August 29th, 1970, there was a large anti-war protest and civil rights protest in East Los Angeles called the Chicano Moratorium March, or the Chicano Moratorium against the war in Vietnam. And the police staged a riot. They said that somebody stole some beer a few blocks away, but that's sort of doubtful. And also an entire riot squad, the entire police department does not show up when somebody steals 2 or 3, 6-packs of beer. So it was clearly, at least in my opinion, having grown up myself in Los Angeles, it was staged. And when they got to the park where the rally was being held, and there were musicians and people were giving speeches, they basically raided and came in with tear gas and the riot squad. So they had planned to break up this rally. This was not a thing that happened because of some, petty theft. Ruben Salazar saw that things were getting a little bit out of hand, and he had ducked out by this time with his colleague, and they went to a small bar club called the Silver Dollar. So
Just to get out of the way.
Just to get, to steer clear and to sort of lay low until, because Ruben Salazar knew that he was being trailed by the police and sheriffs. And then somebody supposedly made a report of a man in the bar with a gun. And so the police, according to the police report, they went and said, everybody get out. And then after everyone left, they fired a tear gas grenade to the back of the bar. What in fact happened, and we know this because Professor he was a professor at Northridge for many years, Raul Ruiz, but at the time he was a reporter and photographer for La Raza newspaper, which was a Chicano newspaper in Los Angeles. He took photographs, and he saw that the police were actually pushing people back into the bar, and then through a curtain, they fired a tear gas projectile, which turned out to be an armor-piercing tear gas projectile, which apparently took off the back of Ruben Salazar's head. What do I think this was a planned assassination? I do. Do I believe that the tear gas projectile hit Ruben Salazar? I actually don't believe that, but that's just my opinion.
You mean you think it was a straight up assassination?
I think somebody else was in the bar that did have a gun, but that it wasn't Ruben Salazar or his colleague. And then they had an inquest, and among other things, they found that the grenade that had been used was designed to pierce concrete or several layers of plywood. It was not a group, like a crowd dispersal.
A close range gas.
Yeah, because there are ones that are designed that have a cardboard cone that wouldn't, kill somebody if it hit them at, reasonable range, might injure them. But they actually used an armor piercing.
Do they know who the shooter is?
Yeah, and I don't have his name. I haven't. I didn't go through.
Was there any kind of investigation?
Yes, there was a coroner's inquest, and the coroner's inquest found that the death was a death at the hands of another. But
death at the hands of another.
Death at the hands of another.
That's rather,
in other words,
not specific.
Murder, but murder nonetheless.
Yeah.
And but not a murder charge. And the deputy that fired the grenade was not in the end charged. So via legitimate.
You're listening to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. That's our good friend, Chicano Studies Chair here at Sonoma State University, Dr. Ron Lopez. I'm Dennis Bernstein, and also with us at the table is our own Miguel Gavilán Molina.
I just wanted to add, Ron, to the story behind Ruben Salazar. And that's that this on this campus, roughly 40, 45 years ago, there was an effort to rename the library. And at first, yes, here on the campus, at first the Mecha students, that's the indigenous Latino group here, proposed Emiliano Zapata. Well, he was a revolutionary hero in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Well, the campus and so forth and the authorities decided that he was a foreigner, wasn't quite appropriate. So the name, another name was submitted. And that was the name of Ruben Salazar. And after about a 2-year back and forth struggle, meetings, the campus accepted the naming of the library for Ruben Salazar. And it was a major victory for the Latino indigenous community in the area because it was the first time the university had selected a Spanish surname, individual, a Chicano, to be named. So it really included the community and honored. But a few years ago, the campus decided to rename the library and take Ruben's name away from the library, and they gave him a hall somewhere is a hall named after Ruben Salazar. And who did they give it to? Snoopy and Charlie Brown. I mean, really? Unbelievable. Really? Because they had the money. They bought it, they made it, and it was just a really injustice, and it really angered the indigenous Latino communities in the area. But that's a battle that happened a few years back.
Have you ever heard this story?
Me, yes. Well, the way university namings happen, just to add a little layer to this, is buildings are named, and then Charles and Jean Schultz basically paid for the new library, which was to be a new building. And so the old library became the new administration building. So now Ruben Salazar Hall is the administration building, but there's also classrooms on the second floor and the first floor. And I teach there quite a bit. And so it's interesting because when I teach there, I always tell my students about Ruben Salazar. And I do tie it to the Andy Lopez story because it is about, part of the issue is that Ruben Salazar was standing up to the authorities, speaking truth to power, refusing to stand down when told to do so. It's really about the police brutality and the murderous efforts of police authorities to suppress dissent. In this case, a dissent that was actually exposing their violent behavior, which sadly in October 2013 took the life of our young neighbor, Andy Lopez, who actually my daughter was in one of the camp, summer camp with him. So he was apparently a very nice young boy. But, he was a 13-year-old boy. He was wearing a hoodie, apparently, walking in a poor, unincorporated neighborhood, the neighborhood of Moreland, which is in the southern part of Santa Rosa, but it's unincorporated county territory. And this sheriff, Eric Gelhaus, saw him. Now, Andy Lopez was carrying an airsoft rifle that he had borrowed from his friend because there was an empty lot that was strewn with trash and broken glass and needles.
Should have been a park.
And the kids would play airsoft there. The boys and maybe some of the girls too would get these guns and shoot at each other, shoot pellet guns at each other for fun. And I think any sheriff in this area would have known that, because there were no parks and there were no facilities, and it's not easy to get from Moreland to some place where there's anything to do. It's an isolated area. It's an internal colony of Sonoma County, if you will. And so the sheriff gets out of the car, shouts at Andy Lopez to drop the gun, and but then almost immediately opens fire and empties his service pistol and hits him 7 out of 8 times, mostly in the back. And one of the shots actually killed him. So Andy Lopez was dead before he hit the ground.
And we're going to talk more about that later on in the broadcast because we have other guests here who know a good bit about it and have been trying to fight for change since that sheriff's murder. But it's important to know a little bit more about Gelhaus's background, that he was part of special forces fighting in Iraq. His job was supposedly he was capturing enemy soldiers and bringing them in for prosecution. So he went right from the war zone to this county, and apparently he forgot that he was not fighting a war anymore. And I believe he fired it was something like 7 shots in 10 seconds. Ron, I want to ask you to sort of broaden your thoughts in terms of, in the context of racism, which is what really claimed the life of Ruben Salazar. What are your thoughts, and how have you seen things change under the current president, who is really a serial racist, white supremacist, who isn't afraid of, deporting thousands of people, separating families, brown children from their mom, putting kids in cages? Your thoughts on where we are at this moment in history?
We're seeing a retrenchment in a direction of a fear of the brown body and the black body, especially brown and black youth. There's, our communities, and especially our young people, the young men in particular, are in danger of being, violently attacked by the police. And young women often are objectified or treated very badly, and all the young people are really undervalued in terms of the potential of their talent and abilities, often because of their appearance, and also because of the social economic class that they come from. This is wrong. This is unjust, and it should be changed. Under Donald Trump is appealing to fears of the sort of parts of middle America, and using a very tried and old tactic, which is to point the finger of blame at the communities of color, referring to us as freeloaders, and I'm paraphrasing, bad hombres, people like Donald Trump and even Bloomberg are advocates for things like the stop and frisk policies. And I would even go so far as to say, under, for example, the Clintons, I know a lot of people were supportive of Hillary Clinton for a long time. Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were the architects of both the welfare reform and the Illegal Immigration Responsibility and Reform Act of 1996.
And that is an incredibly important point, but because what's at the heart of the matter there is this concept developed by the Clinton administration that if you make it difficult enough, dangerous enough to cross over from Mexico into the United States, if you're too frightened, if you think if you have more fear about dying, you won't come. They were wrong.
Yeah, they were wrong, and it's really an irony and a sad irony that even the extremely conservative President Ronald Reagan believed that immigrants should have a chance at becoming citizens, and the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which is wrongly called an amnesty. It's not an amnesty because people had to pay hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars to go through the process to become legal residents, and in some cases U.S. citizens. But they removed the provisions shortly after the enactment of the law that penalized employers who exploited workers. So, a lot of my friends fall into this class of undocumented workers. And to give an example, places like Safeway or Target or Walmart have been fined, huge sums because they have systematically exploited undocumented workers. They pay a fine, but their profits still far exceed the fine. One of my close friends who lives in Oakland would say that she would come in and every month and a half, she'd be told to stay home for 3 days. She'd come back and she'd have a new employee number. because it was the employers that were actually rotating their Social Security numbers to keep them off the books. And then the minute they got a letter from Homeland Security, they would simply rotate it and send people home for a day or two. And this was a standard practice.
The one thing that policy has done, Ron, and Dennis, and I think you'll agree with me, is that it's had an incredible effect on young people who were brought here with their parents fleeing violence and destruction and death and war. The situation in Central America during the 80s under the Reagan administration destroyed those countries, destroyed the infrastructure. And a lot of folks left those areas, Salvadoreños, Nicaragüenses, Hondurenses, Guatemaltecos, that whole region, no jobs, lack of clean water, lack of food, drought, all those things. People fled. And when they fled, they left a lot of children back with their grandmother, with their grandfather, or a family member. Those young children have grown up and they've come seeking some of their parents. A lot of the images you've seen in the last year or two, those are those kids that have grown up now, who are young adults seeking to reconnect with their parents, who they haven't heard of for years, and sometimes will never find them, because every year at the U.S.-Mexican border, 300 to 600 people are found dead from dehydration, and sometimes bullet-riddled bodies from vigilantes. But the young people, the DACA students, have you had any experience with a student that got the DACA sort of like protection from the Obama administration?
Yeah, a lot of our students do have DACA. They tend to mostly be Latino students, but also students from other backgrounds. Sonoma County, as well as Alameda County, the East Bay, has an African population that's small but notable, mostly Eritrean and Ethiopians. We also have, of course, a large Asian population, primarily in the East Bay and the Peninsula. And although my understanding, or what I've heard, is that Asian immigrant students who might have DACA don't refer to themselves as dreamers. They don't use some of the same language, but nonetheless, they can be beneficiaries of the same programs, and many of them are.
Before we let you go, obviously we're right in the middle of a presidential election. Do you see there are essentially 3 Democrats left in the race now? Is there one who you see as being a little better for the lives and the interests of brown people, which is a growing almost majority in this state and this country?
Well, I'm personally a supporter of Bernie Sanders, but in order to get Donald Trump out, because of the nature of our electoral system, I will probably end up voting for whatever Democrat comes, to the presidential election, because we don't have a parliamentary system. We don't have a ranked choice at the presidential level. We don't have a system of proportionality like they have in some European countries. So to me, it doesn't make, it's a winner-take-all system.
Is there one candidate who has articulated a plan or a focus that you think would be more meaningful to the community that you often represent?
Well, I personally like Bernie Sanders, but I think, one of the things that I've been hearing,
is there a policy? I haven't heard much articulated. We talk about creating a humane immigration policy. That's a phrase that people throw out, but what's it mean? And is any candidate talking about it, really?
I don't know. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I guess no, I don't know. I don't know there. I think the one that comes closest to talking about immigration reform that allows a pathway to citizenship is Bernie Sanders. He seems to be the one that is saying the most, but also he is appealing to a lot of the youth. I saw some reports saying, Bernie has the young Latinos in the West and maybe in the Northeast, but Biden has the older African Americans in the South. And this really speaks to some of the complexity of both the Latino and the African American communities that electoral behavior. For example, in the Latino community, about a third of us regularly vote for either conservative or even Republican right-wing candidates. And so there's not like a Latino constituency. It even breaks up by ethnicity, it breaks up by region. Without going to a lot of detail, I think that it's important to look at these different communities not as monoliths, but as mosaics of different interests, different generations, different backgrounds, and different political experiences.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Professor, for joining us on this special edition of Fans here live at Sonoma State University. It was always good to see you, Ron, to talk with you, and you always have so much to add.
Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. What we're going to do here is we're going to take a short musical break. You hear that, folks, back at the mothership? Then when we come back, we're going to talk more about Andy Lopez and what Miguel and I remember in terms of the sheriff's response. What I remember is going to a student protest where all the kids left their school. They protested in front of, I guess, the sheriff's department. And what Miguel and I saw was sharpshooters facing down, about 10 of them, with their barrels pointed at the children. Stay tuned.
You got a copy of your book for me? Where's your book, man?
I left it.
See?
I got one left. We'll get to it next time.
Next time.
All right.
You just
Miguel,
published the poetry.
are you gonna tell me what to do here? We're gonna thank you.
Okay,
We're gonna heist you out. We're gonna bring these two folks up.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's share this microphone. We're still on music.
Did they
Yes,
get their
please
guest?
tell me yes.
Do they get their guests?
Well, what? Okay, I want to come back in 5. Where are we, Falcone? Are you going to give me the finger? I can't see you. And we are live back here in Sonoma State University. Delighted to be here with the students and dealing with the issues, some of the issues that impact this community and other communities all over the country. We are going to continue our look at sheriffs and police brutality and murder. And we might, oh, thank you very much. We've got another microphone. Thank you for that. And we have two folks at the table who've been fighting, I guess, since that murder to figure out ways to restrain the sheriffs from feeling like they're so frightened after they come back from a war zone that they're going to shoot a 12 or 13-year-old 7 times in 10 seconds because, I don't know, they felt threatened. By the way, it is interesting to note that Gelhaus was also a columnist for Soldier of Fortune, if I've got that right. This sheriff who shot this little kid, not only that, but he also was a consultant to a weapons manufacturer, and he perfected sights. So he definitely, from close range, he didn't need 7 bullets. He wasn't in danger. Anyway, want to welcome both of you back in. Let me start at the end, if I could, with you, Liz. Tell us about, your initial reaction and the kinds of things that, what were you doing at the time and how this motivated you?
Okay, well, thank you. I'm a preschool teacher by trade and the mother of 4. And for years in this county, I had read in the newspaper about incidents involving the police departments, the sheriff's department, where there would be officer-involved fatalities. Often they would be families calling with a loved one in distress, mental health crisis, and law enforcement would show up and their loved one would end up dead. So I was outraged, but I had young kids at the time and couldn't really be involved, or didn't feel like I could. But with the shooting of Andy Lopez, a couple of things came to bear. One is my husband was the firefighter that responded that day. He was the first one on the scene to Andy's shooting. And he called me that afternoon telling me what had happened. And I could hear in his voice the devastation. I just felt just a gut punch. I had a son with a BB gun, a teenager once, and I just felt like, I had to be involved. And so it started with protesting. I joined, many of those student marches that you talked about. Myself and my youngest daughter, who was still at home at the time, joined also. And we became involved. We went to meetings. We went to the Board of Supervisors. And there was just a groundswell. I was certainly not alone. There was a groundswell of emotion and protest in the community. And that led to finally, at long last, some action by our Board of Supervisors when they appointed a task force, the Community Advisory Task Force, to decide what could be done to make things different so it didn't happen again.
All right, let me also bring you into this, Omar Paz. You were at Santa Rosa Junior College at the time. You were a trustee there, a student trustee. Tell us how you heard about this, and please lean into them.
Yeah, so at that time, I was actually student body president prior to becoming trustee. I was just involved with our local junior college Mecha Club, with our Black Student Union, as well as being the student body president. So for me, kind of a representative of my term there, it was about coalition building and about unity amongst our different cohorts. We had student leaders there that were really focused on bringing race and that dialogue to our student body. And this incident really catapulted that into a different direction where we were immediately responding to a community in crisis. The middle schoolers and the peers of Andy Lopez came to our Mecha organization in our meetings, and the leadership then sent letters to all elected officials in Santa Rosa, to the Board of Supervisors with a list of demands as a result of the killing, which went unanswered. And from there, things escalated to the march on the sheriff's office. If we weren't going to get a goodwill attempt to sit at the table, we needed to have some sort of visible action to show how much unrest was going on within the campus community and the community at large. It was a ripple effect. And yeah, thinking about it for me just puts me in a really deep a place of hurt and anguish, because I spent a year and a half with this at the forefront of my mind. But again, we mobilized, and like you said, that was one of my first times organizing a march and support. I just did everything I could as a student leader to give money, to facilitate, to give the voice and platform for these younger folks, the middle schoolers, so they could do something and feel heard. And we came to the sheriff's office to the end of gun barrels, and it was a very interesting feeling, knowing that following processes and being in these positions of leadership doesn't guarantee your safety, and it doesn't guarantee that you'll get a good answer for the kids who are really looking for someone to take ownership of a needless killing. So from there, as Liz mentioned, the county established a task force. Supervisors and the sheriff came to sit down with myself and a few of our club leadership, and we had a talk, and just essentially again reiterated our platform. And then I was appointed to the task force by the sheriff at the time, Sheriff Freitas, which was a little weird. I had no relation to him. I had no prior experience working with him, but I still can't figure out why he picked me. But yeah, and then from there was a year and a half of grueling meetings of something that was my introduction to public processes and bureaucracy, and it was really tough.
I just want to add to that. not too long after that session, I believe, with Sheriff Freitas, he resigned. And it looks like in this county, the sheriff is picked by the correctional officers, the officers union, that anoint somebody they want. I think that's where the problem began. It should be an elected office. The person running for sheriff needs to be accountable to the community. The Latino indigenous community was just slapped in the face. I mean, here you have something which was, if you look at the facts and the evidence, I mean, that day that Gail House approached Andy Lopez, he had his partner with him, who was also armed. That officer never got out of the car or fired his gun.
So the partner didn't feel threatened.
No, and it was an attempt to brush it under the carpet, and at that time, I believe the district attorney, Jill Ravage, just completely didn't even pay attention to the family and the pain that was suffered in that community.
I think the troubling thing about that fact, Miguel, was that the partner, Gelhaus, the killer, was a trainer. He had 25 years experience. He was training somebody in that car. The person who he was training didn't feel threatened, but it appears that Gelhaus was trying to teach him a lesson. And it is interesting that in one of his columns at Soldier of Fortune, Gelhaus went through this whole routine about how this is before this killing happened, how you can get away with killing a kid as long as you can convince the jury that you felt threatened for your life. Now, does anybody here think a 25-year veteran with military experience training another deputy felt threatened, or was it a murder? This is what I guess you all investigated.
Well, unfortunately, there's a history of, a long history, which still holds true to this day, of the district attorney, even though they look into these cases, the law enforcement offices basically, investigate themselves. They do have a thing called the Chief's Protocol, which they established a number of years ago, in which if a shooting happens, let's say in the sheriff's department, then the city of Santa Rosa Police Department will do the investigation. But in every single one of those cases, not one has ever been, has been found to be worthy of bringing charges. Also, the district attorney has never once brought charges. And it really just defies logic. I think that the public could accept and understand if someone had made a mistake or done something out of, in some type of egregious way, whatever. But if the department would admit it, it actually helps engender trust rather than this constant circling the wagons. But I think that what did happen, some change did happen, and some positive things did come out of that. And one was, as Omar was saying, the task force met for 15 months, and out of that they made a number of recommendations, 22, I believe, recommendations to the county, and some were enacted, not all of them. 3 out of 22, but one was the formation of an oversight office for the sheriffs.
Well, let me ask you about that oversight committee. It seems like, at least I've been getting a lot of, undercurrents of people's concern that the sheriff, and I've heard some positions, I've read some of his positions, the current sheriff right now, that he's been undermining the efforts of the oversight committee. He's quietly dismantling it, and it looks like that by doing what he's done, it's taken the teeth, if there were really any teeth ever with the committee. What can be done to stop that? I mean, how is your group working to prevent that from disappearing? Because again, we go back to the Wild Wild West, where the sheriff decides, what is best, and will get doesn't have to be accountable or responsible because he's not voted in. So there's a feeling of, I don't have to answer to the public. I can do whatever I want. How are you dealing with that?
Okay, well, I was one of the founding members of the Community Advisory Council of the first oversight office that they founded after the recommendations from this task force that we referred to before. And there's definitely been a pushback recently from the sheriff, there's no doubt. But just to give a little evolution of how it came about, the original office that was envisioned by the task force would have at least 4 members. And it was kind of watered down. It didn't have as many powers as a lot of oversight offices, but it would have an auditor function. So it couldn't do investigations. It didn't have subpoena power. However, it would be able to review investigations that the sheriff's office had done. So what they started with in 2016 was a 2-person office, 1 director auditor and 1 assistant, an office assistant. And then the Community Advisory Council, of which I was a part, which would be a link between the public and the sheriff's office. And our job was community outreach and also to hear from the public on concerns and issues regarding anything having to do with the sheriff's office, and also to look at policies and to review policies and to recommend policy changes to bring them up to best practices and best standards. But what happened was, like you said, we had a change in sheriffs. We had, initially it was Sheriff Freitas, who had been the sheriff during the killing of Andy Lopez. He did retire for health reasons. And then after that, there was an interim sheriff, Sheriff Giordano. And initially we had good cooperation. The office found that after the fire, the 2017 Tubbs fire, that the sheriffs began to feel like maybe they didn't really need to be told, or they didn't really want that oversight. There's definitely a pushback that started to happen then. And also at that time, the director really started to dig in and see what was really kind of going on and start to notice, it takes time to get things going and to see what you're looking at. And I think he started to find that some of the investigations he was reviewing were incomplete, or they were deliberately not accurate, or people had deliberately not been interviewed in cases of use of force or incidents that happened at the jail. And so he started to write about it in his annual reports, which is the way that the public can have some transparency and see what's really going on. But what happened was that a little 2-person office really isn't enough to do that job. So it was deliberately underfunded and inadequately supplied with what it needed to really, robustly to properly do its job. And then we had an election, and this time it was the first time, Miguel, that we did actually have several people running for office. And I think it was a direct result of the shooting of Andy Lopez, that we actually had people gear up and said, okay, hang on, this isn't right. And so we did have 3 major contenders, and that was, uplifting. However, the one who won was basically the choice of the union.
And the union with a lot of money to spend on who gets elected and who they want to have. We just have a minute left, but let me give you, Omar, the final word. And it seems like this event really changed your life, or the way you think a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I think that nothing's been the same since that moment for me in terms of my involvement and where I am able to position myself in community work. As after graduating, I went to UC Santa Cruz. I came back and I worked at the Family Service Center in Sonoma Valley at La Luz Center, working with my community, I'm Mexican American. And after that, the killing of David Ward in December in his own vehicle was what essentially catapulted me back into this work, where I'm now the campaign manager for a petition for the Evelyn Cheatham Effective Iolero Ordinance. Iolero is the Office of the Sheriff's Auditor's Independent Office of Law Enforcement Review and Outreach. And we're essentially trying to give this office the teeth we wanted in the first place. We want to give it a bigger budget. We want to give it subpoena power, meaning that instead of negotiating with the sheriff, they're compelled by law to give the records they need for the investigations they're doing, and just other mechanisms that ensure that the community's voice is put first and foremost in this work. because that's why we're here to begin with, is we want community input to be taken and actually implemented by the sheriff's office, and not just, leaving it at a community forum or a community meeting or leaving at talking points.
Beautiful. Well, I want to thank both of you for sharing this incredibly important material on this day here at Sonoma State University. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to hear about the Venerable Peace and Justice Center of Sonoma County. Stay tuned.
Thank you.
All right. And we're back for the final segment here at Sonoma State University. Pleasure to be here. And well, let me ask you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and something about this wonderful place where you work called the Peace and Justice Center of Sonoma County.
Thank you, Dennis, for having me here. My name is Shakina Black. I'm the Executive Director of the Peace and Justice Center of Sonoma County, a nonprofit organization that's been active for 36 years, originally founded around nuclear disarmament. And over the years, as issues have changed, we've grabbed onto what we can be at the forefront of. So we're dealing with a lot of homeless action issues and immigration rights issues and whatever needs to be done. We're a support and a resource center for the community.
Do you think, when was it founded, do you know?
1983.
1983. So, do you think there's more or less need for a center like that in the age of Trump 220?
I absolutely think it's vital, and we have to
Why?
well, you just said that the name I don't even like to say, for one, and I think after that election, a lot of people came out of the woodwork, and somebody told me this word, slacktivist. They were accused of being a slacktivist. Instead of an activist, they were slackers. And so a lot of people have come and said, I need to do something, and do something. What I'm seeing, Dennis, is a lot of what I call the active activists, some of our elders. They don't stop. They just keep going and going and going. And then there's a lot of people who don't do anything. And so that's not okay. I think everybody needs to do what they can, but step it up a little bit, and help. Really, there's a lot of issues to get behind it.
What are some of the things that you are involved in?
Well, specifically, we fiscal sponsor some groups. So Homeless Action, they're dealing with, we just had, I hate this word too, but let's say it out loud, sweeping the Joe Rodata Trail. They were sweeping people, by the way, 250 residents, and the end of January, when it was cold and still raining, they got swept. And so some of those people were placed somewhere, and then a lot of them got scattered to the wind. So we're support for those kind of groups that may not have their nonprofit status, but we can lend our support to them.
There's a homelessness epidemic
Absolutely.
in this country. I rarely hear any of the candidates mention that struggle, and there are more and more older people, more and more women, older women stuck on the streets now, people who work their entire lives, who never thought they would be living in their car or, on the run because it's illegal to be homeless.
Absolutely. Dennis, I actually know a woman who's in her 80s, her son is in his 60s. They live in the front of their small pickup for 2 years. They were in the shelter for 6 months, which they didn't like because there's a lot of drug addiction and alcoholism, and they don't fit that profile. And so it just tears my heart when I see her, because why can't we house this woman and her son? He's her caregiver. They're living not like in a luxury pickup. They're living in a cab of a pickup truck. It's not okay.
Dennis Bernstein here with Miguel Gabriel Molina.
And that crisis, homelessness continues. I mean, it's almost, the unwanted, like the undocumented community in some areas is unwanted. And what do you do in that situation? Here we are, one of the richest counties of California. It's a magnet for tourism. We got the wine industry, the craft beers industry, and then now you have the the marijuana industries that bring in busloads, bring in, carloads of people every weekend coming from outside the area, especially coming from the south. You know it, the congestion that happens between Novato and Petaluma, and it's all tourism coming into the area. So you have all this wealth, and yet we can't take care of the homelessness. Now, I'm in this room right here, ballroom 3, on the 3rd floor of the Student Center building. And one of their exhibitions, as you see around the room here, is Vietnam vets. Vietnam vets who came back and became peace activists. Well, a quarter, if not a third, of those homeless persons are Vietnam vets. And sleeping, sometimes not even in little pop-up tents, but sleeping on the cement, with something covering them over. I mean, how can we remedy that? Again, there's so much wealth in this county, and yet we have this problem.
I think it's bureaucracy, to your point, both of you, that the elected officials don't want to talk about it because they want to be reelected. And so they just sweep, they do these convenient sweeps, and it's appalling, and people, if you see someone homeless, at least look at them in their eyes and see them as a human and not a piece of garbage that you need to sweep up. It is our brothers and sisters. It's our grandmothers out there, and there for the grace of God go I. Any one of us could be there at any time. And it is an absolute epidemic, not just in our county, which, by the way, California being the 5th largest economy in the world, and yet we have 25% of the United States homeless population here. That is really skewed numbers. That is not acceptable. It's unacceptable. I don't know what the answer is, but we have to rally, we have to elect the right officials. That's a good place.
The answer isn't to criminalize homelessness. The answer isn't to arrest food givers like those who work with Food Not Bombs. On our show, Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio, that you're listening to somewhere in this world, we have a regular segment called Food Fight with Keith McHenry, who's the founder of Food Not Bombs, and he talks to us often about the way in which local lawmakers and state lawmakers are creating a structure that literally has turned being homeless into an illegal action. And this is a troubling situation. And the indication is that there's only going to be more and more homeless. The 1% is doing quite well, thank you, and the rest of the world is really suffering. That's why, of course, it's so troubling to see somebody like Bloomberg come in and buy his way into elections. You notice they purged the black people from that election so that they can make room for Bloomberg. Then the Democratic Party changed the rules so a billionaire can come in. And now everybody's cheering. This drives me crazy. That this billionaire was going to help Joe Biden get elected. What happened to people's concerns about money in politics and buying elections? It's a shocking situation, and you never hear these corporate journalists talking about this. That's because if Bloomberg is going to spend $1 billion on commercials, notice there were commercials, so you have Elizabeth Warren attacking Bloomberg during the debate, and then the commercial comes on, and there are 6 women praising Bloomberg for what a wonderful human being is. Does that get to you?
Yes, absolutely, it gets to me. I also want to go back to what you were talking about, Andy Lopez. Andy Lopez would be 20 years old on June 2nd.
He'd be maybe a sophomore.
Maybe, exactly, at Sonoma State University. And that crime, I was also there the day the march happened at the sheriff's office. So that scar is there in the community. It did not go away. Some of those young people were deeply affected and became activists themselves, like Omar, so I want to, just that work needs to continue. And also one of the things we have at the Peace and Justice Center right now are 10 photographs of young people who died in ICE detention at the border. And so every day at work, I'm looking at these young people, including toddlers. There's a little 7-year-old girl. We issue the Sonoma County Peace Press 6 times a year, and this current issue, the March-April issue, has a little photograph of this little girl. That one kind of makes me tear up all the time. So, these are issues. So whatever people want to be active about, you don't have to take it all on because nobody can change the whole world by themselves, but please do something. If it's climate change, if it's immigrant rights, if it's homelessness, just do something, please.
All right, and Miguel, final words.
Well, we're going to come back here, I believe, at 7.
We're not going to be on the air at 7, but we're going to be back here speaking. And obviously, there's a lot more to say.
And a lot more information. But the most important thing, I think, is everyone here and everyone that isn't here needs to wake up. Not only is the world, not only we, facing global warming, which in 30 to 50 years will probably destroy humanity, but we also have the most dangerous person in the White House against our democracy, our civil liberties, and who doesn't care about anything other than image and profit. People need to wake up, break their bubbles that they live in, and if they're awake, you need to wake up your neighbor.
Want to let people know, we have about a minute left. Tomorrow, on a special edition of Flashpoints, we're going to be remembering the marvelous and exalted Nicaraguan poet Ernesto Cardenal, who passed away just a couple of days ago. He was a part of the Sandinista government. He was purged from the Catholic Church for that, but recently he was welcomed back into the church. He was an incredible poet, the Minister of Culture for Nicaragua, and an extraordinary human being. And we're going to wrap it up here. I want to thank you, Miguel. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all out here for inviting us to the campus. And we're going to turn it back over to the mothership. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks, folks. Pass on the information. And don't forget that if you didn't vote yesterday, register to vote. Register your family members, your neighbors, your homeboys, your homegirls. Register everybody you know and vote like your lives depend on it, because it just might.
Thank you.
I didn't get into my shower about your.
Oh, I do that all the time.
Producer for a nationally syndicated show called Flashpoints. And we were invited to come here today. 1, 2, 3. Oh, no. Mambo. So as I was saying, we were invited here to be part of this peace and social peace and justice week. Dennis asked me to open up. First of all, I'd like to thank those of you that are here that have made the time to be presente, and also those of you that are not here. I met Dennis back about 20 years ago, and back in 2003 joined the team Flashpoints. And it was a real exciting and challenging time for me. And I found myself just so overwhelmed with excitement and just ready to go, because I realized that our station, KPFA, and the program Flashpoints focused on the alternative news, focused on the untold stories, on the issues that mainstream social media doesn't even look at, because there's no profit margin at the end. Working with Flashpoints enabled me to focus on issues that affect my life and those around me. Dennis gave me the opportunity to bring certain issues to the forefront. One of the biggest passions I've had throughout my life, because I came up during the 60s, was the peace movement, was the anti-war movement. And it offered me the opportunity to look at war, and particularly its effect on indigenous and communities of color. and how the war impacted our communities. The second issue, which has always been a social justice issue for me, was cannabis, marijuana, and the historical reference to the indigenous Latino peoples in regards to cannabis. And I found myself in the mid-60s joining a big group of what we call ourselves outlaws, because society and the government in those days, people could be arrested for a joint and spend 10 years in prison. So I really jumped into that as an issue that really affected me and my communities. The other issue was Native issues, indigenous issues, and farm worker issues, labor issues, and ultimately the issue of immigration reform. It gave me a platform and the support. I never had that kind of support, even though I had been at KPFA for almost 20 years. I never got the inside support until Dennis hired me to come onto the Flashpoints team. And we've been on the road. We have a joke amongst ourselves when there's a crisis across Indian land, who gets the call? We do. And we've traveled. We've traveled across the country. We've traveled to Minnesota. We've traveled to New York. We've traveled to Standing Rock. We've traveled to the border countless times, to Tijuana. We've traveled to Arizona, and we've been at the forefront of those issues. And I wouldn't be where I'm at today if I hadn't had that support by Dennis and the show. Now we go across Indian land, people welcome us. We go into farm worker land, people welcome us. We go into the anti-war communities, people welcome us. And I can't tell you how many times people have said to us, wow, you're the only press that showed up. You're the only press that cared. And I say that's why we're here. So people know, hey, there's a crisis in their community, be it on the southern border or be it up north, we will be there. I tell people, hey, just take care of our transport, give us a place to flop, and all we can eat, and we'll show up. Well, burritos every day can get kind of old. No, but it's, again, the kind of response we give. We've seen ourselves as a first response unit before that became popular, first responsers, and we're strong. Okay, that's a great slogan, but we've been that for years. We get the call, we're out there, we come out there, we travel. Sometimes we've driven for 2 days. Sometimes, a lot of times, Dennis will fly there, you know, because we're 80 miles, 90 miles an hour on the roads chasing caravans of trucks that go crazy. And that's how we travel. And he'll travel, fly down there, we pick him up in the morning, or we pick him up at night, and we're ready to go the next day. So that's how we do it. A lot of our efforts are out of pocket, you know, because we don't have the kind of support and resources that we need from our particular station. There's other priorities, which is sometimes baffling to me, because the work that we do is to address the voiceless, is to give that microphone, empower those communities. When you show up in those areas, and sometimes people get watery-eyed, they can't believe that somebody in the country cared, and we're there presente, ready to do it. So that kind of excitement and opportunity only came by my joining the team. And it's sometimes disheartening, because our station should be more eager and ready to support the work we do. But in some ways, we're the radicals of KPFA. We don't fear, we're fearless. Right now, this government in power in the White House has used fear as a tactic, to keep us afraid, to keep us living in terror, uncertainty, unclarity. But that doesn't affect us. We will show up wherever, whenever, if we're called. But yet, like I said, the commitment is there from Dennis, the flashpoints, the show, but not from the business aspect of our station. At one point, I was told, Miguel, the situation at the border is a Mexican thing. I said, what? Did I just hear that correctly? And at that particular meeting, which was department heads, I said, you know what? You people are living in the dark. You're inside a bubble, inside a mayonnaise jar, and you haven't opened it up yet. I said, it is not a Mexican thing. It is a human rights thing. It's a family thing. It's a children's thing. It's humanity. And I walked out of the meeting because everybody got a little kind of perturbed from what I was saying. I was bringing truth. And as I walked out, the person that said it chases me down and she tells me, Miguel, I hope you don't think it was racist what I said. I looked at her, chuckled briefly, and walked away. I wasn't going to give dignity to her for the lack of understanding and sensitivity. So flashpoints, we're here to burst the bubbles, wake people up to the new reality. There is a crisis on the planet which saddens me terribly. The planet is dying. And in 30, 40 years, if you have kids and they're little, they might not live into their adulthood. Because at some point, the way the earth is going, we have 30, maybe 50 years. So I'm here to beat that drum and hopefully wake people up. We're here to bring the crisis at the border, which the administration just brought it to every sanctuary city, every town that's sanctuary, every state has brought the border into our communities. Well, our communities are made up of everybody, not just brown folks, not just black folks, not just Asian, but all people, white folks on different sides of the aisle. It involves all of us. And I'm just asking you, in times like this, we have to show compassion. We have to have empathy in our hearts. What fuels me and Dennis is the fire in our hearts to get truth. And right now we have a battle because we're truth defenders. We are warriors for the truth. Truth in this country under the current administration in DC is becoming an endangered language. We all have to stand up. Last week, the president ordered tactical military units to support the efforts of ICE. Now, think about the word ICE and think about language. I've heard ICE all my life. Hey, we're going to put you on ICE, or he's on ICE. What does that mean? That's the words that coroners use, right? Or even police, or in movies that I've seen about the mafia. Oh yeah, he's going to be put on ICE. What does that mean? It means you're dead. You're in the morgue, they put you on ice and stick you in the refrigerator. How ironic, huh? That they got this word ICE to come after and hunt down brown people within the United States territories, the land of freedom, justice, and liberty for all. I brought up the question, what would happen if kids were coming in with their parents in the Canadian border and they were white? Would they be rounded up, separated, ripped, physically struggling and ripped children away from their mothers as the mother is fighting, kicking to hold on to her baby child or her child or her children? Would that be happening if they weren't brown? That is a question we have to ask ourselves as a country. This country was built on two things: genocide of indigenous peoples. Something like over 53 million indigenous peoples died so they could have the expanse of this land called the United States. And once they wiped out the indigenous nations, oops, we have no labor force. They brought in African Americans by force from Africa to be the labor force. So this country was built on genocide, forced slave labor, and immigration. This nation was built on immigration. So now we have a situation of people from Central America coming here because their countries were destroyed during the so-called Iran Contra and that whole debacle that the Reagan administration did. Those children have grown up today and are returning, searching for their parents, searching for the lost father, the lost mother that migrated back 30 years ago. That's what we're facing here. People leaving their countries that were destroyed, their infrastructures leveled. We have a refugee crisis at the border, seeking refuge. Isn't this what this country was built upon? Accepting the refuge, the weak, the hungry. Well, listen, I can go on, but at this point, Flashpoints, Dennis, and being on Free Speech Radio has enabled me to focus on the issues that mainstream media cannot cover because it offers no profit margin. And now,
talk a little bit about how you met the incredibly important story.
you know, this is a wine country. It's probably one of the richest counties in the state. Not only does it have wine industry, but agriculture is at its center. It has the wine industry, the craft beer industry, and the cannabis industry. This is the gateway to the Green Emerald Triangle. Every week, you see carloads, busloads of people coming up here to enjoy what Sonoma County offers. And yet, you have a slave labor force that is still struggling to get a decent wage, still struggling to get, $15 an hour. And I came out of that struggle. I was 12 years old and working in the fields. Child labor was part of the reality. In those days, there was no anti-children labor laws. I came from a family where there were 6 of us, me and my siblings and my mother. My mother became one of the first, if not the first, Mexicana, Latina, forewoman in the fields, which gave us a big sense of pride. There's my mother, the forewoman, managing 100 workers. And it was one of those days, it was late. We used to work from 6 in the morning to 6 at night. We used to get a half-hour lunch, no breaks. And if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to sneak away and hide. There was no facilities, no fresh water, anything. And I remember that day, it was 6 o'clock, I was tired, I was hungry, and I'd been placed with the men because I could speak English, and I was kind of tall y flaco, kind of tall and lanky. So they said, you boy, you speak English, you can run these guys. These were men, hombres. But there I was, kind of working on the crew of men, and I had to keep up with them. It was brutal. But at the end of the day, it was about 6 o'clock. The field, I don't know, it was maybe 3 miles long, the rows. We were picking grapes. So it was late in season, September. And I remember somebody noticed a cloud in the distance of dust. And everybody stopped. Is it the INS? We call it La Migra, which is short for immigration. Oh my God, is it La Migra? Is it the INS? And all of a sudden, these men, full-grown men, they start looking like deer, not knowing whether to run and to hide. because usually it meant that within 10 to 20 minutes, there would be a raid. So everybody's waiting, everybody stopped, and then all of a sudden, we begin to see that, wait a second, that's not their trucks. It was a station wagon and a beat up truck, and it was flying these red flags. And then they came up, and it wasn't the INS, it was a bunch of Latino students, Mexican students. And then they started talking to Bullhorn, hey, don't be afraid, come up here, come, vengan todos, vengan todos. And, you know, I knew English, so I went, I was like, wow. And they said, hey, hablas inglés? I said, yeah, I speak English. So we started talking. He says, hey, we're here to tell you that you all have rights. What? You have rights. You have rights to overtime. You have rights to a bathroom and clean water. You have rights to a break. You know, you have certain rights. What? And I was baffled. You know, I'm a kid, I'm 12 years old. And then the men asked me, what, ¿qué están diciendo? And the students started speaking Spanish. And I'll tell you something, I saw these men, and, you know, all these guys were probably, you know, in their 20s to 50 to 60 years old. There was probably about a couple of dozen workers. And, you know, I knew most of the men, but they were always, you know, hunched down, looking at the ground. And one by one, they started coming to the truck and beginning to listen. And one by one, I saw these men go from their hunch down and looking at the ground, never being able to really look up. One by one began to stand straight. Some of them took off their sombreros and they started looking up at the sun and the sky. I said, wow, look at this. And then questions. What, you mean we can have a break? Really? 1 hour lunch? No way. ¿Cómo es posible? How can that be possible? We're just burros. I remember one of the men saying that. And that got me right in the gut. You know, in other words, we're just donkeys. We have no rights. But these students said, yes, you do. You make the wine company rich. You make the owner of the land rich with your labor and sweat. What? Yeah, and you also have a right to have fresh water. When we wanted water, they used to have a big truck that had a coffee can that was rusted. And that truck was used to spray on the dirt roads to keep down the dust. Who knows where that water came from? Probably came out of the river. But that's where you went to get water. And I used to go, God, I couldn't drink it out of the can because it was rusted. I would turn it on. They said, no, that's not drinkable water. It's not for human consumption. So I go, what? And everybody started talking, wow. And we can have bathroom breaks. We don't have to ask permission. We don't have to go hide in the bush. That day, and me seeing those men for the first time in their lives, being able to stand erect, take off their hats, and say, I'm a human being. I am not a donkey. That's why today, I came out of these fields of misery. I call them the fields of misery. Because I grew up. After school, I put this weird little lunch bag I had, and then take off my shoes and put on, back in those days, they were called PF flyers, cheap tennis shoes that made you believe you could fly over, you know, fences and, you know, run faster. I would put those shoes on and run 3 miles to get to work. You know, crisscrossing the ranchos, you know, the fields, and get to work and work till the sun went down. So I know what it is. I consider myself an escaped farm worker from the fields of misery. And KPFA and Dennis have given me the opportunity to bring this human story to you. Because we all eat vegetables. We all eat fruit. Some of us like wine. Some of us like to engage in those things. Well, who is out there slaving? So the story is your story too. It's a story of all of us. So without further ado, I held back my emotions because it's been a long time, and here we are. Back in those days, before that, as I said, I did mention my father because he'd been taken away a few years earlier by a program of the United States government called Operation Wetback, in which they rounded up over 3 million of us, mostly citizen children, and shipped back to Mexico. And here I am. You know, I swore to myself, because my father, they came to our chicken coop. The first years of my life, we were raised in a chicken coop. And they came one night. We didn't have a door. It was just a little gancho. And they just blew the door open. My father was in his boxers and wife beater t-shirt. That's what Chicanos wear. And he didn't want to go. And there was men with rifles and guns in the one little tiny room. And he didn't want to go because he wanted his pants. They didn't let him put his pants on. So he resisted. It took about 10 of them beating him up with rifle butts till finally he collapsed. And I didn't see him for another 8 years. But that's my story. It happened here in Sonoma County. I'm living proof of that. That's why I'm grateful for Dennis giving me the platform to bring these stories to you. And now, without further ado, give it up for Dennis Bernstein.
Since I'm Dennis Bernstein, and since I know you all love poetry, I'm going to read you 1,000 poems. No, that's not what I'm going to do. Thank you, Miguel. I appreciate all the work you've done, all the doors that you've opened. Miguel and I just had the privilege to attend the opening of the new Culture Clash, Still in America, at the Berkeley Rep. You might want to check that out. Miguel was friends with Culture Clash. They are the geniuses who, with Richard Montoya as a writer, who have been dealing with culture and the clash of cultures and the powers and the problems that occur out of that. And Miguel has opened up many doors. We just did a beautiful interview with Culture Clash. Did I say who Miguel knew before they were Culture Clash? And I just saw an amazing photograph of Miguel, like rail thin, hanging out with the guys that would later be Culture Clash. Anyway, I'm a journalist and I'm a poet. I used to work a lot in the mainstream. I've probably published major pieces in just about every mainstream and alternative newspaper in this country. I've done investigative reporting. I've gone undercover. And we do believe in truth to power. We do see our radio station as the canary in the coal mine of corporate disinformation. We are aghast and amazed that you could see that these networks, these corporate networks, are so shameless that you can have a situation where you got a billionaire like Bloomberg, who during the Democratic debate is getting taken to task for his disrespect of workers and women by Elizabeth Warren. And in the commercial, there you got the network that's doing the debate is making hundreds of thousands of dollars because there's Bloomberg with 6 women talking about how much they love him. Do you see the irony of that? Rachel Maddow, all the rest are just as bad, but Rachel Maddow started out with about a $700,000 salary. After 2 or 3 years of Trump shredding, she's up to $8 million. Where do you think the $500 million that Bloomberg just spent, who do you think got that money? Those corporate networks who are what? Going to give you an unbiased interpretation of the news? So that's why we have a problem with the corporate networks who essentially, they sell their product. The network's product is they sell you, the audience, to one corporate interest or another. Sometimes the stuff that they sell you in the commercials might kill you. The networks don't care about that. If there's an airplane crash, they just take down the airplane commercials for a week. They don't do anything about fixing the planes. God, why do I want to all of a sudden do a break and say you're listening to Flashpoints? I'm so used to taking a break every 15 minutes and doing that. Forgive me. There's a lot of things that I could do. I do write in the morning because it's my counteract to the suffering. Usually I'll wake up at about 5 o'clock and write until 7 or 8 o'clock when somebody calls me up and tells me a story that makes me cry. And then I get angry, and then it's time for another day of journalism. And that's how it works. But the poetry, first of all, everybody should read poetry. If you're going to be a journalist, if you're going to be a writer, if you're going to be a thinker, read poetry, because poetry helps you get new language. It's the poet's job to create new language, to make language so that you can express yourselves and find the words that you need. My mom was a poet, and I love her for her poetry. One of my first poetic moments, it took me about 40 years to write the poem, but when I was 8 years old, if I was lucky, my mother, who went to work, I would sit there next to her, and she had this roll-on makeup, and she would let me roll it on her face, and then she would say things like, "Dennis, that's my war paint." And my mom would go to work in that man's world of the 50s, where she'd fight for her rights and use the words and use the poems to make her point. And these executives who got paid for her good work would find these poems up on the walls and in various places, giving them the message they need to hear that they couldn't hear in regular language because they didn't respect women. So I do news during the week. So the news story is the story of the day, and the poem is the story of the eternity. I'm still reading Kabir and Rumi from the 12th century to get my news and information, if you will. So the poem is the news of the day, and poetry is the news of the universe, the news of the century. But I first started to learn about Miguel's struggle and the struggle of young people and old people in the context of incredible racism in this country. As a teacher, I used to teach in New York City on the Lower East Side, in Harlem, in East New York, in the South Bronx, and in Rikers Island Prison, which I used to call the gates of perception. And I began to learn a lot more about the struggles of people. I lived in a white neighborhood, was a working class neighborhood. If you were brown or black and you walked through that neighborhood, you better have a reason or you'd be in trouble. I was a Jew. It was a Christian neighborhood, so I was essentially, they hated Jews even more than Latinos and blacks. So I think I had a fight every day in the schoolyard from age 12 to age 18. But here are some poems of those early days. This is a book I called Special Ed, Voices from a Hidden Classroom. And it's sort of, that hidden classroom is still in my head. Those kids are still falling off their chairs to get me to tell their stories to the world. And this book is part of those stories. So just wanted to read you a little bit, get some poetry into it, forgive me, but this is called No Tongue in Cheek. And it's based on a student I had in East New York, and it's based on a real story of an activist in Haiti who was opposing the US-supported death squads and had her tongue cut out as a message that you don't talk about this regime or you're going to die. This is called, I haven't read in a while without my glasses, this is going to be interesting. This is called No Tongue in Cheek. Pierre's on the run from Haiti. He had to leave in a hurry when the soldiers came to cut his mother's tongue out. He says they took her tongue because she talked too much. But Pierre could never get enough. Even when she scolded him, it was kisses. Some nights he dreams about his mother's tongue, flies it around like a magic carpet. And let's call this pea brain. You know, my classroom, I was considered, I was in the emotionally disturbed program. Really, I was a emotionally disturbed teacher working with rightfully troubled kids. These racists would, you know, sometimes the way I would get my new kids is an assistant principal would show up at my door, push the door open, he'd be struggling with the kids, throw the kid in, close the door, and they'd say something like, maybe you can do something with this pea brain. Here's one of the poems about that experience. Pea brain. This one's a real pea brain. That's what Dean Riley tells me as he shoves Jason into my classroom and shuts the door in our faces. Next morning, Jason is spinning jacks on the hard tile floor. He calls me over and insists I hunker down for a front row seat. Look, says Jason, look at the ballerinas dancing on their tiptoes. That was the child that vice principal referred to as a pea brain, having a vision of jacks spinning as a ballet. What do we think? Was that a pea brain? Oh, I write in the beginning, in the introduction to this book, that problem started with me. When I was in kindergarten, my mother was called in by my teacher who had the good news and the bad news. The bad news was I was borderline mentally retarded, and it wasn't a good thing. But the good news, she said to my mom, who was already starting to squint her eyes a little bit. The good news is, with some special ed, with some teaching support, with a lot of help, your son can probably grow up, get a job, and have a family of a bunch of dumb kids. No, she didn't say the dumb kids, but that was what was implied. Of course, my mother said, excuse me, son, go wait outside. And she told that teacher, who happened to be Mrs. Bernstein, the same name as mine, didn't help much, that I wouldn't be returning to that class. Oh, this is called Paulie. I'm going to get my glass. Very exciting, everybody. This is called Paulie and Sadie Play Catch. These children that this book is based on were living in a place in New York City called Far Rockaway. Has anybody ever heard of Far Rockaway? It is the only place in New York City that's a double fare on the subway. It's all the way out at the shore, at the Atlantic Ocean, and it goes along the ocean, but it is the forgotten ghetto. It's where the city wants to place either poor people or old people who don't have any money and forget about them. So I used to take my kids who were, it was a beautiful program that they had for a while that I managed to luck out and get into. And they would supply a bus. I could call for a bus. I did it almost every day. And I could take the kids out of school and go to different places. So we went to museums and we went all over the place. And I also would take them to old age homes throughout Far Rockaway. If I take them to the museum, the guard would start gripping his gun, getting ready to do battle with these crazy kids who were coming in from the hood. But when I would take my kids into the nursing homes, they would become saints. And they brought such joy to the folks in these homes. It was quite astounding. So I'm going to read you an introduction to that section and then a poem from it. The State Home for the Aging is a forgotten island of loss just down the block and around the corner from our schoolhouse. It's ringed in by a 12-foot-high barbed wire fence meant to keep out the junkies who use flashlights to search for their veins after sunset. On one side of the home is a hospital, and across the street a torched-out funeral parlor. The sun never comes to the residents of the old age home, except as reflected through the eyes of my kids. This is called Paulie and Sadie Play Catch. Paulie is playing with Sadie at the old age home. Paulie takes out his pink high bouncer and places it firmly into Sadie's hands. He whispers for her to roll him the ball. Sadie smiles like a toothless child when Paulie takes this stance, poised to catch her fading world. For Sadie, Paulie is a patron saint. No matter how many days of the week he gets cuffed to a wall in juvenile hall. And this is called Masking for Touch. And there was so much fear that comes out of racism that when I would travel with my kids, or even they would be seen as criminals because Black and brown people in this country are always held under suspicion. It happens all the time. So I used to do mask baking with my kids. It was a way that I could use to get some of the so-called toughest kids in the school to touch each other. Masking for touch. They are making masks out of paper mache. One lies down, the other does the sculpting. The toughest kids take turns touching, tracing highways around cheekbones and chins, around the crucial hairpin switches of nostrils and lips. For a moment, touch is more than a threat crushed into a fist. It's the river of their ancestors as it flows through their veins. Soon, a fragile new face is lifted, born with a life of its own, and lightning is breaking across the dark eyes of the Creator. This is my book. It's just a new book. It's called Five Oceans in a Teaspoon. It has just come out. It's an autobiography and poetry that's taking me about 40 years to write. And if I don't get it open, it may take me 40 years to read. I want to read you from the section Front Lines. It sort of draws on my experiences as a journalist and sort of in the street. War correspondent. Whose death do I report first? Whose ashes get top of the fold? Where do I bury the missing in action? You can all join in on this one if you feel like it. It's called Social Studies. Wars start in the memory and leave memories that start wars. Wars start in the memory and leave memories that start wars. Start in the memory and leave memories. You get the idea? We've been in Afghanistan 18 years making war, and they still can't end it. PTSD. Homeless war hero argues with his missing limb. No one else will listen. Medals. She asked the colonel at her boy's funeral if he knew, so again, it's called Medals. And this book has been visualized by an amazing visionary genius. It's also made into animation. Some of these poems have been animated and with music. We worked with one of the composers for Hamilton. It was quite an amazing experience. And if you go to Five Oceans in a teaspoon.com, we have the animations are up at the website. This is called Medals. She asked the colonel at her boy's funeral if he knew how to pin them on a dead boy's ashes. Sorry about that. Fast track citizenship. Green card corpse in marine issue body bag, poised to become an American. This is about the bombing of Nagasaki. 70 years ago in Nagasaki, tending rows of mangoes on the back ridge, I thought it was just a regular bomb. That's in the voice of a survivor. This is called Back Then. I don't know if you've all heard about the implications and the suffering that has taken place around US. They used to do above ground atomic bombing tests in Utah, in Nevada. They used to order soldiers in the what are those islands down there? The Bikini Islands. They used to do bomb testing there, and they'd order the soldiers to watch the bombs, and then they would tests on the soldiers. The soldiers became the guinea pigs. I interviewed, there was a group called the Atomic Veterans, and Anthony Garusco was the head of that group. And he used to say that the Atomic Veterans, those veterans who were ordered to watch those explosions, were the, what did he say? They were the, oh, God. Sorry. This is called back then. This is about this is about those tests in Nevada. Back then, oh, and it's the voice of a survivor of one of those tests. Back then, none of us thought much about living next to an atomic test site. My Uncle Nicky felt kind of lucky, being he was blind and all. The only time he ever eyewitnessed anything was when one of those atom splitters fired up a second sunrise. And I would like to read for you. It is the anniversary of my daddy's 20th anniversary of his death. Oh my God. And it's an interesting time. I've been thinking a lot about it because my dad, my grandmother, who I'm named after, my father's dad, died a couple of days after giving birth to him as a result of the influenza epidemic of 1917, 1918, which killed more people than World War I. Amazing time. And it's called Strong Medicine. And my father was an amazing guy, incredibly courageous. I hope I can be near that courageous. Let me find out where this poem is. I know we have a there's 300 poems in this book. It's called Strong Medicine. When I went to see him, I didn't realize how close he was to death, and I got into the emergency, into this special care room, and I saw him across the room, and I saw, oh my God, my daddy's going to die. And you know, it was one of those moments where you know you can't think, you can't not think, you can't move, you can't not move, because you know you will break down if you do. My father reaches out through death, through the wires that were, you know, that line was getting thinner and thinner, that death line. He's come a little closer. Come here. He obviously saw how upset he was. Come on closer. Come on closer. Come in closer, son. So I got real close. And he reaches out and he takes a piece of the old sweater I was wearing. My father was a tailor and a furrier. He used to make coats for rich people. That was long ago. He reaches out, touches my sweater, feels the material, and says, "Nice material. Where'd you get it?" So then he said, it was a snowstorm outside. And he said, "I'm sure I hear the ice cream truck outside. Can you go get us some ice cream? Have it a round of ice cream, my treat." Strong Medicine. The night before he died, he craved for ice cream on a stick. He swore he heard the bells outside, the truck across the street. Could I sneak out and buy a round for all of us? His treat. There was no truck across the street, no crisp bells crackling, but the canteen in the basement did have 2 dusty old machines dispensing pops and cones and cups. I filled the slots with coins. At 50 cents a shot, those two machines unleashed more vital pain relief that night than the steady drip of morphine clouding father's final scene. Ah, the lute he beamed and drew a shallow breath and then another. I toast to the bitter and the sweet. He tore the wrapper off his treat before he lost his breath completely. I watched him eat. I watched him eat like a kid on the sneak before dinner that night as death took a brief back seat to a chocolate-covered ice cream bar on the stick. I really want to thank you all for coming, for having the courage to walk through that dangerous virus and come here and be with us today. It's much appreciated. I love my brother Miguel for all that he gives to us, and I hope that you will stay tuned to Flashpoints on Pacifica Radio. Again, thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here. Okay, questions? How about that? Anybody have any questions? Miguel's got all the answers. But did you have a question? You? You're also quiet? Okay. Okay. How many, by the way, I like to ask this question. How many people in this room have ever written a poem? I like that. It usually goes something like this. Slowly, all the hands go up, and then usually somebody will come up. I know you know the one you are now. Somebody will come up to me and say, "No, I didn't raise my hand, but actually, I did write a poem a long ago. I think it was a terrible poem." But the only reason that people don't write poetry anymore is because English teachers who were taught to hate poetry don't know how to teach it, and they end up ruining it. But the poets define the future of the language. They find the language that we need, that we don't have yet, that we need to refresh what we have to say, or find a new way to fit the, if you will, the 21st century. Again, my book is 5 Oceans in a Facebook. Thank you. What's that? It's just out. I'm not selling it here, but it's, I'm not going to say it's on that monster, but it's a lot of different places. You can have the publisher too. Just Google 5 Oceans in a teacup if you're interested in the teaspoon. If you're interested, the visuals are absolutely beautiful. I want to get into my book and get my release. Yeah, thank you.
Please fill out a comment sheet if you haven't. Bring it to the powers that be to try and get resources.